Most people grow up believing the world is shaped in public, that nations live or die because of elections, revolutions, arguments on TV, or whoever is shouting the loudest on a debate stage. But the truth is quieter and a lot more unsettling. The real story of why your paycheck feels smaller, why groceries cost more, why your country sinks into debt while still calling itself strong, that story was never written at the ballot box. It was written in rooms you'll never walk into. Imagine a world where democracy is the show, but economics is the script. Where presidents come and go, but the ideas guiding the money system stay the same for decades. You vote for a leader, a slogan, a promise. But behind that promise sits an entire framework built by people you didn't elect, people you've never heard of, people whose names never appear on a ballot, analysts, economists, policy architects, the ones who design the rules long before any politician steps up to pretend they can fix things. This is the illusion no one warns you about. Countries don't rise or fall because of personalities. They rise or fall based on ideas. And ideas, especially the powerful ones, rarely start in public. Look at the world you live in right now. Your country's national debt didn't magically appear because a president overspent one year. It exists because decades ago, someone in a quiet office drafted the blueprint for how money should be created. Your interest rates didn't suddenly jump because one politician made a bad choice on Tuesday. They moved because a small group of central bankers met behind closed doors and decided the price of borrowing should change. Global markets didn't expand because voters demanded it. They expanded because think tanks, advisors, and international committees laid out a plan for a more interconnected world long before anyone asked regular people if they actually wanted that. And once these ideas are built into the system, they stay there. Policy becomes structure. Structure becomes reality. Reality becomes the thing you blame on bad leadership, even though the real decisions were made years before that leader showed up. That's why so many people today feel like nothing changes, no matter who wins. Because in the world of economics, democracy isn't the engine, it's the decoration. The engine is the ideology powering the institutions behind the curtain. The engine is the theories chosen by the people who design monetary policy, who push globalization forward, who shape credit markets and government spending, who decide how your economy works before you even know what economy means. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a system built on influence, academic theories, and private consensus, far from cameras, crowds, and political theater. And once you understand that, everything else suddenly makes sense. Why wages stagnate, why inflation hits harder than explanations suggest, why nations drift into the same mistakes again and again. Because you're not watching a spontaneous world, you're watching the outcome of a blueprint. A blueprint created long before you cast your first vote. In the early 20th century, the world entered a kind of economic storm it had never seen before. Industrial cities were exploding with new machines, new workers, new factories. Markets were becoming global. Money was moving faster than governments knew how to control. Everything was changing except the people in charge. They were still relying on old rules, old instincts, and old political habits that no longer worked. And when the Great Depression hit, their confusion became impossible to ignore. Nations weren't just struggling, they were lost. Into that confusion stepped something new. Something that looked harmless, even academic. Not armies, not politicians, ideas. The first think tanks arrived quietly, almost politely, like helpful librarians showing up in the middle of a burning building. Brookings in the United States, Chatham House in Britain. They didn't claim power, they didn't campaign, they didn't stand on podiums or knock on doors. They simply offered something the world desperately needed: guidance. But the guidance they offered didn't just describe reality, it shaped it. Their reports, research papers, and expert advice weren't just documents. They became the starting points for national recovery strategies, industrial reforms, and even wartime decisions. Presidents and prime ministers read their recommendations not as suggestions, but as roadmaps. Slowly, almost silently, these institutions built the invisible architecture of modern economics. They taught governments how to manage unemployment, how to structure central banks, how to rebuild after crises, how to tax, borrow, invest, and plan like modern nations. And because the world kept getting more complex, leaders kept returning to the same places for answers. This is where the blueprint behind today's global economy truly began. Not in parliaments or rallies, but in quiet rooms filled with researchers drafting the ideas that leaders would eventually call policy. It was the birth of a new kind of power. Influence without a face, authority without a vote. By the time the Cold War began, the world had already accepted that think tanks could guide policy. But Rand Corporation didn't just guide anything, they rewired the entire purpose of these institutions. Rand wasn't built to observe the world. It was built to predict it, simulate it, and redesign it. Born out of the US Air Force, Rand treated global politics like a giant chessboard. Their researchers weren't just economists or academics, they were mathematicians, physicists, psychologists, people who believed human behavior could be measured, graphed, and forecast like the weather. They created nuclear strategy models that tried to predict how a superpower would react if pushed too far. They ran simulations where thousands of virtual decisions played out in minutes. They built behavioral theories that assumed nations, like people, could be manipulated if you understood what motivated them. This was the moment think tanks stopped being passive advisors and became something closer to strategic engineers. Rand didn't just help policymakers respond to the world. It helped them design the world they wanted to see and avoid the one they feared. Soon, their influence spread everywhere. If a general wanted to know how an enemy might react to a new weapon, Rand had a model for it. If economists needed to understand how markets would behave under pressure, Rand had a simulation ready. If presidents needed to choose between negotiation or escalation, Rand produced scenario maps laying out every possible outcome. And slowly, other institutions copied the blueprint. Foreign policy, intelligence, national security, global economics, every field began building its own version of Rand. The result was a new era of policymaking, one where governments relied not on instinct or tradition, but on engineered predictions. A world where decisions about foreign wars, interest rates, and international finance were shaped by invisible algorithms, simulations, and strategic models. A world designed long before anyone saw the consequences. By the 1970s, the world had changed again. Inflation was raging, oil prices were exploding, and countries were drowning in debts they didn't know how to manage. And into that chaos came a new kind of power. Not just one influential institution, but dozens. AEI, Hoover, CFR, the Peterson Institute, Heritage, Carnegie, each one with its own worldview, its own mission, its own idea of what the future should look like, and each one backed by donors who expected their ideas to win. This was when think tanks stopped being rare and became an entire ecosystem, a battlefield of ideologies disguised as research. They didn't just study the world, they competed to define it. And governments, desperate for answers, listened. Deregulation didn't rise out of nowhere. It came from white papers arguing that markets would self-correct if freed from rules. Financial liberalization didn't happen by accident. It came from studies claiming that global capital flows would make everyone richer. Globalization didn't spread because people demanded it. It spread because the biggest think tanks on both sides of the Atlantic pushed leaders toward a world where borders were open, corporations were mobile, and national industries had to compete on a global stage. Austerity, the idea that governments should cut spending even during economic pain, wasn't a universal truth. It was a theory promoted so aggressively that it became political common sense. Not because the public voted for it, but because a room full of economists convinced leaders it was the responsible choice. Every major shift from the 1970s to the 1990s, from the end of capital controls to the rise of Wall Street dominance, was shaped by this network of ideological institutions. They created a kind of manufactured consensus, where ideas became inevitable simply because enough influential think tanks agreed on them. The world we live in today, globalized, financialized, and often unequal, didn't evolve naturally. It was built, designed, engineered through decades of intellectual competition, and most people never even noticed it happening. If you want to understand why certain economic ideas rise and others vanish, you can't just look at the thinkers. You have to look at the money behind the thinking. Because throughout the 20th century, a hidden web of donors quietly decided which ideas deserved a microphone and which ones should fade into silence. The Rockefeller Foundation funded early research on global development and international finance. The Ford and Carnegie Foundations poured money into academic economics, foreign policy studies, and global governance models. Later came open society, pushing liberal reforms. Wall Street banks supported institutions that favored deregulation and financial expansion. Defense contractors backed think tanks tied to national security strategy. Tech giants supported research on digital markets and automation. Oil companies funded studies protecting energy interests. No one had to issue orders. No one had to say, here's the ideology we want. It didn't work like that. Influence didn't come from direct commands. It came from alignment. If an idea supported the long-term interests of the donor class, it received funding, visibility, conferences, fellowships, and media reach. If it didn't, it struggled in the dark. Economists rarely fight over morals, they fight over research budgets. And in the world of think tanks, budgets decide which theories survive. Ideas that promised open markets, global supply chains, financial liberalization, and strong corporate influence spread quickly. Ideas that warned about inequality, financial fragility, or concentrated power stayed niche. Not because they were wrong, but because they didn't fit the incentives of the people writing the checks. This is why economic thinking evolves like a species. The ideas that align with powerful interests thrive. The ones that threaten those interests quietly go extinct. It feels democratic from the outside, a competition of arguments. But behind the curtain, it's natural selection, a slow shaping of the intellectual world by those who can afford to sponsor it. And over time, the entire architecture of modern economics began to tilt in one direction toward the worldview of the people funding it. If you've ever wondered why every new government promises change, but the economy somehow keeps moving in the same direction, the answer isn't in the speeches, it's in the people who write the policies. Because behind the stage of elections and campaigns, there's a quiet rotation happening, a revolving door that connects the most powerful institutions in the world. A banker at Goldman Sachs leaves for a senior role at the Treasury. A Treasury official moves to the IMF. An IMF economist lands at Brookings. A Brookings researcher joins the Federal Reserve. A former Fed vice chair ends up at the Council on Foreign Relations. And when their time there is done, many of them go right back to the private banks or consulting firms they started from. It's not a conspiracy, it's a culture, a pipeline, a small circle of experts who all studied at the same schools, trained under the same professors, read the same theories, and trust the same institutions. They may switch badges, but they don't switch worldviews. This is why political change often feels fake. Elections swap out the faces on camera, but the economic engine is still being operated by the same network of people. They may disagree on the details, but the core assumptions: global markets are good, financial liberalization is necessary, central banks must stay independent, austerity is responsible, growth solves everything, remain untouched. This is how continuity survives every political cycle, not because voters demand it, but because the same experts keep returning to the same roles, carrying the same ideas into every institution they enter. The system doesn't need to force anything. It simply recycles its architects. And so the public sees a new president, a new cabinet, a new direction, while behind the curtain, the same worldview continues to guide interest rates, debt strategy, trade deals, and financial regulation. It's not that elections don't matter. It's that the deepest layers of economic power don't rotate with the vote. They rotate with the revolving door. And until you understand that, political change will always look real on the surface and hollow underneath. In every generation, there's a moment when a single document, a report, a forecast, a policy brief suddenly becomes the center of national attention. Investors scramble, politicians quote it on TV, journalists repeat its talking points. And regular people feel the effects months later in their rent, their wages, or their grocery bill. Most never stop to ask a simple question: who wrote it? Because in the world of modern economics, think tanks don't just study reality, they define it. They take complex data and turn it into narratives, stories about what is safe, what is dangerous, what is inevitable, and what governments must do next. And once enough powerful institutions repeat the same story, it becomes the expectation everyone else must respond to. A report from the Peterson Institute warning about rising national debt can shift an entire country toward austerity. A paper from Brookings suggesting a rate hike can influence the Federal Reserve before the public even hears the argument. A forecast from the Council on Foreign Relations about global instability can push investors into defensive positions, changing markets overnight. These ideas don't stay trapped on the page. They ripple outward until they shape decisions made on trading floors, in boardrooms, and inside government meeting rooms. This is how consensus gets manufactured. Not through votes or public debate, but through repetition by credible institutions. When enough think tanks agree on something, it starts to sound like truth. And when markets believe it, governments follow or they get punished by investors who do. That's the quiet power of narrative. Think tanks decide which risks matter and which can be ignored. They decide which solutions are serious and which are radical. They sketch the future that leaders believe they're choosing freely, but the reality is that expectations are steering them long before they act. And the expectations come from a world most people never see. There's a layer of the system even deeper than the famous think tanks, the ones with big buildings and polished websites. These institutions don't appear on talk shows. They don't publish flashy reports on social media. Some of their work isn't even meant to be seen. Yet their influence reaches further into your life than any politician you've ever voted for. These are the research units that prepare classified economic forecasts for the G7 before global crises hit. The advisory groups that whisper into the ears of the IMF and World Bank before they set conditions for struggling countries. The analysts who develop policy frameworks for the Bank for International Settlements, the institution that quietly coordinates the rules every major central bank follows. Their teams are small, their budgets are huge, their impact is invisible, but everywhere. And even though their meetings feel far away, their decisions land right in the middle of your daily life. When they warn central banks that inflation might rise, your interest rates go up. When they argue that debt levels are unsustainable, governments tighten budgets and social programs shrink. When they predict that global markets need stability, your paycheck stays the same while prices climb. When they push for stricter banking rules, your ability to get a mortgage changes overnight. You don't see the models they run or the projections they debate, but you feel them in your rent, in your student loans, in your weekly shopping, in the quiet panic of watching your cost of living grow faster than your income. This is the final truth most people never hear. The biggest forces shaping your life aren't elections or headlines. They're the ideas crafted by institutions designed to stay out of sight. The places where the future is decided long before the public knows there was even a question. And once you understand that, you can finally see the world for what it is, a system guided not by chance, but by blueprints written in rooms almost no one enters. By now, the picture should feel clearer, not more comforting, but more honest. The world you live in wasn't shaped by the arguments you see on television or the political fights that flood your feed. It was shaped by something far older, quieter, and much more durable: ideas. And those ideas were designed long before you were even born. For decades, analysts, economists, strategists, and donors have been building the intellectual architecture that governments inherit. Every election is just a new driver stepping into an old machine. The dashboard changes, the slogans change, the promises change, but the engine underneath stays the same. It's powered by the frameworks created in think tanks, advisory councils, research groups, and committees that most people will never hear about. This is why left versus right feels like a loop, why every crisis seems familiar, why inflation rises, falls, and rises again, why debt piles up no matter who is in charge. Why wages stall even when the economy is supposedly growing. Because politicians don't set the boundaries of what is possible. The architects behind the ideas do. Once you see that, the noise starts to fade. The headlines look smaller, you stop blaming personalities and start noticing patterns. You realize that the global economy runs on intellectual blueprints crafted by people who don't run for office, don't give campaign speeches, and don't change direction every 4 years. That's not conspiracy. That's structure, architecture, a system built on expectations, incentives, and theories that have been refined for generations. And if you truly want to understand your future, your mortgage costs, your wages, your debt, your opportunities, you can't just follow politicians. You have to follow the ideas shaping the world they walk into. Because this series isn't just about telling you what happened. It's about showing you the architecture behind what's coming. Layer by layer, we'll break it open so you can stop reacting to the world and start anticipating it.